Good afternoon and welcome to CEC-UGC lecture. In the series on sociology of India, today we are going to understand village studies. Village studies in India is very important in order to understand both the development of sociology of India as well as the way in which anthropologists and sociologists have studied the Indian society. So most of the time we understand that people have a kind of a close feeling with village. Most of us know that people say a very large percentage of India lives in the village. It is the heart of India. Now we need as sociologists to understand from where are these ideas coming. What is the origin of this whole idea of village being central to the understanding of Indian society? And to do this, we will traverse through the historical origin of village studies in India. So we know that village studies are not only in terms of studying small communities in agricultural setting, but it is a sociological discovery of vast social cultural diversity. So the origin of village studies goes back to the whole idea of the concept of community, where the effort was being made to understand civilization, culture, community. And in this whole episode, there was this urge to understand the vast diversity in India itself. One of the variants was along lines of occupations in terms of social cultural setting, and therefore a dichotomy was created between the rural and the urban. The rural where the villages lived, and it was also identified as traditional. So we will see how this understanding goes back to the idea of colonial understanding of society in India. So village studies are part of one of the multiple ways. So it's not just one way of looking at rural India or agricultural setting, but it's just one way of looking at the social cultural dimension. And most important, it is a way to understand social change. And for this, we need to go back to the entire discipline of sociology in the West as well as sociology of India was emerging in the context of large-scale social economic changes. So village became a point of contrasting between part or a community which was required change, which required development, and therefore there was this understanding of kind of associating this notion of development, progress with Indian society. So we go back to the whole idea of how did it begin, and therefore it's important to understand that though study of villages may be a recent origin, but the study of rural society, which was kind of conceptualized as the point where we could study villages or the location of villages, dates back to 18th century during the East India Company. And most of the attempt during the East India Company was to acquire first-hand information basically on the land tenure, the practices, the agrarian conditions, and this was required by the British East India Company as necessity data required for getting an idea of the economic, socio-economic conditions of India, so that they could kind of become better ruler, or they could become better have a better hold over the Indian society. So the British administrators were encouraged to study village communities to have first-hand comprehensive information, particularly in the case of the caste and tribal society, which for them appeared to be a kind of a unique phenomena to be found only in India, and therefore a part of this ethnographic insight into India. Some of the accounts written by the early British officials were based on direct observation and experience, contained the basic ideas of the description of villages. So there was no analytical understanding. There was no kind of going into the assessment or evaluation, but just kind of a descriptive in terms of the economy, in terms of the social condition, in terms of the cultural practices of these society. And there was a kind of a plethora of writings or records which were available to give us a descriptive understanding of village. And some of them are W.F.M. Firminger's, and this is the 5th report from the Select Committee of the House of Commons on the affairs of East India Company. The second, which is more important, and we'll be discussing it in our lecture, is Charles Metcalfe, and he kind of brought out the Minutes of the Village of Delhi, and this was published in 1830. The third is H.S. Main, and which Metcalfe, Main are kind of considered as bringing about a complete understanding of village life in India. So H.S. Main's publication was Village Communities in East and West, and the fourth is B.H. Baden-Powell, The Land System of British India. So if we look into these reports and the writings, we see much of the focus was to understand agrarian system and rural structure. So with this, the whole idea of the shift comes in by the beginning of the 19th century, with the colonial rule kind of taking out a lot of survey and a lot of kind of studies on Indian society. The survey report of Francis Buchanan, the gazetteer of Walter Hamilton and Edward Thornton, came out in the beginning of 19th century, and subsequently routine imperial as well as district gazetteers were written, which depicted the Indian village life. The Henry Main and Baden-Powell, who are kind of considered as important in terms of the giving us understanding of what the village life was. So in the later part of 18th century, provided insight into sociological aspect of structure and change in Indian village. So we know that this is also a point where the understanding was to do a kind of an understanding of society, whether it was static, whether there was some amount of change, or how the economic changes were impacting village life. So much of the documentation was to talk about how much of social change was taking place in the village in India. And if we kind of look into Karl Marx, he had also had a keen interest in the nature of village community in India, and he would agree with the whole idea of the British administrators' opinion, including Main and Metcalfe, in terms of Indian villages as self-sufficient unit, as closed economy, in terms of stagnant, not going about change. And for Marx, it becomes important evidence of the existence of communal ownership of land. So he was kind of an idea also that it was not in terms of the understanding was not in terms of feudalism or peasantry, but here the exploitation and appropriation was in terms of the economic factor, which was also in terms of the ownership of land and access to land revenue by the upper class. So then we kind of understand that there were several ways in which we look into how village was conceptualized, and therefore the first important way, and which is again very common in terms of understanding the discourse on village during the colonial time, was the description of village as little republic. So the fifth report from the Select Committee on the Affairs of East India Company, the villages were described as the most basic unit of social organization in India, a sovereign whole, irrespective of transfer of power from kingdom to regime at the national or regional level. So if we look into this description, we see very clearly that the idea was to give in some kind of adjective in terms of isolated, self-sufficient, little republic. Munro gave the term mini republic. So these were some of the phrases which was used to explain village life. In 1832, Charles Metcalfe famously termed the Indian village as little republics that were almost independent of foreign relations. So the whole idea was that there was no kind of interaction, there was no kind of interlinkages, they were just small units, and they were kind of content within themselves, and they had no vision for progress and development. If we look into this whole idea of little republic, isolated, self-sufficient description of village, this continued for a very long time, and even during the nationalist struggle, we see Gandhi coming in support of the idea of villages as self-sufficient. But here the whole idea of Gandhi was to ensure that there were certain political programs and welfare. So he was kind of looking towards a more reformative angle. For the Britishers or the Western scholars, it was the idea to contrast villages with the Western peasantry, and to keep up this whole hierarchy of India as inferior or subordinate. Gandhi looked at it in terms of self-sufficient, in terms of as a kind of praise of it, and also how colonial rule had brought about or disintegrated the social structure, and therefore he was in favor of programs and policies that would bring about a overall development of villages. So if we look into the Gandhian view, he says that he kind of villages were independent economic unit and is against the jamindaris and ownership of land. So the whole idea of the villages belonging to the mass, where he as a nationalist leader wanted the people to go back to their root, it was the villages, and a kind of a community where there would have been no exploitation on account of economy. So he looked into jamindari and the various kind of hierarchy as problematic, and suggested that it would be the tillers of the land who would be actually the owners, because they were putting in the effort and labor. So Gandhi was also viewed that there should be communal ownership of land for balanced cultivation, and the surplus land, if any, must be distributed to the rest of the villages. So he was in kind of kind of something which was based on egalitarian understanding, and the whole idea of sharing, which kind of would do away with the exploitation and appropriation of wealth. All the good and services necessary to the village member should be grown within the village. So it fitted well into his the movement of Swadesi, and into the whole idea of kind of giving credit to the people themselves and come out of the hierarchy or inferiority complex that Indians were not capable of doing certain activities. So he said that it could be within the decentralized form of politics, where everybody could kind of have a stake in the politics and economy. So if we look into this whole idea of isolation, autonomy and self-sufficiency, Indian sociologists and anthropologists have kind of critiqued this, and a number of them have kind of considered this as illusionary. The most significant contributor in this regard is M.N. Srinivas, who through his study of the Rampura village kind of argues that self-sufficient and autonomy as described in the colonial documents was kind of illusionary. So he further says that the village has always been a part of wider economic, political, religious system through inter-village roads. Though the roads, the economic conditions were not very good, there was no monetization, it was based on self-sufficiency, there was an absence of market economy in the way it is in a capitalist society, yet it was kind of not isolated and autonomous. So the members of the caste living in village were bound by ties of kinship, marriage, economic obligations and membership of caste panchayat. So these were some of the instances where Srinivas is saying that there was a kind of interconnections between different villages. The other illustration that he gives in his work is the existence of weekly market, which was patronized by people living in a few neighbors, and also sometimes it was kind of a specialized weekly market. It implied that this one particular market specialized, say, in cattle. So people in the neighboring villages would have to come to this specialized weekly market for trading. Therefore, the idea of isolation kind of remains a myth. There was also the whole idea of pilgrimage, which would take villages beyond the village. So pilgrimages were important places of worship which was not necessarily located within the village. Every village had their religious cult, but then there were certain areas which were kind of considered higher in order, and visit to these places was considered as part of their religious life. So the visit to pilgrimages was also an evidence of interconnected. Then the next example that he gives about is periodical festival of a deity. They attracts devotees and others from nearby villages, and bazaars springs up around the temple. So there is an embeddedness of economy and religious. They are kind of not different. Even we see that they are around a lot of temples or religious places, the market flourishes, and there is a kind of lot of interactivity, interconnectivity among the people of different places. So when we look into village, the one was the whole idea of village as isolated unit, and there are discourses which are negating it. The second way we look into the understanding of village is to understand it as an ideological category. That is, it is an idea created by scholars, including both Western and Indian scholars, about the life of a village, which is then contrasted. This is contrasted with the urban, or it is contrasted with the modern. So there were various binary oppositions which kind of help to place the idea of village in terms of development and change. So the study of village was looked as a strategic point of entry for the study of Indian society and culture. So this idea was created that if they wanted to understand India, what India is, what the conditions of Indian society is, the way out is to have a full-fledged study of the village. Village was seen as the ultimate signifier of the authentic native life, a place where one could see or observe the real India and develop an understanding of the way the local people organize the social relationship and belief system. For Andhra Bethe, in his work Caste, Class and Power, the village was not merely a place where people lived. It had a design in which were reflected the basic values of Indian civilization. So this kind of a construction of a kind of also a romantic idea of in villages representing true Indian society and culture. And this fitted well within the community and national imagination. So it was kind of constructing, it is from the documentation of the colonial Britishers that there was the counter argument being given, and this counter argument comes in terms of also giving rise to a sense of community and national feeling. So India was essentially described as a land of villages, where the British colonial rulers imputed qualities of autonomy, stagnation and continuity. It does help to justify their rule over the subcontinent. The idea of village was accepted as given, characterizing the essential Indian reality. So the whole counter argument against such a description of India was to create an alternate idea, and that idea was to kind of build villages or develop villages such that it would be able to overthrow the British or the colonial rule. So the whole understanding in terms of even the colonial or the administrative discourse was to understand caste and kinship, and the most important was in terms of understanding peasant, because it was also a category which was in the West, which was kind of undergoing change because of urbanization and industrialization. So therefore, to understand the nature of change which was taking place in India, the category identified was village, caste and family. So drawing inspiration from the spate of community studies in the United States, 1930s and 40s, the Indian sociologists entered the village in a big way. So it was not only a site or ethnographic site for the Western scholars to study Indian society through the villages, it also became an important point for the emergence of this discipline of sociology and anthropology in India. So the study of village gained immense popularity because it was looked at a natural junction of both caste and the peasant life. So caste was again some important category or an important identifier of Indian society. And how could you study caste? You could have to study going to one of the selected villages, and therefore there was many a time there was a kind of lack of distinction whether it was a study of the caste system or it was a study of the village. So caste emerged as the core area of sociological research, as it was considered to be the central and defining institution. We have already done a lecture on the study of caste system and caste and social change. So we can understand from there that there is kind of an intuitive road to understanding the village society in India. Then the third way of looking into village studies in India is to understand how villages were described as social and political entity. Social in the sense of how the caste was changing, how families were coming up, there was any kind of a change, how external forces were impacting the economy of the society, and also in terms of how the panchayat or system or political entity was being maintained. So according to Andhra Bate, the two important focus of village study, one is to document the nature of traditional social life of the non-Western world. So this is within the, again, we put it into the opposition between the West and the East, and then we have this whole idea of civilized and the barbaric. So in order to understand do a comparative study, which was again the key methodology of anthropologists, was to describe the features of India as a social reality in terms of explaining the social structure. And if the West, it was identified with the peasant, India was identified with the caste system, and therefore it kind of becomes the understanding of describing social life of non-Western world. So the second concern of village study, according to Andhra Bate, is to understand the concern within the social science for the agenda of development study that would look into the real India in social organization and cultural life. So influenced by the prevailing structural functionalist paradigm, we will look into the various perspectives in which were used to understand village and community life in India in the second lecture. Here we try to understand, by the beginning of 19th century, the structural functionalist paradigm of Rattle Brown and the other anthropologists was kind of used by Indian anthropologists and sociologists to understand the relationship between the different dimensions of social life. So you could have understanding of the functional element of caste, of religion, of family. So a number of studies were done by Adrian Mayer, who studied caste and kinship in central India, and there were also a number of village studies which were now being done by economists, because it was also a time for the early part of 20th century where the idea of progress and development programs and policies were in picture, for which there were requirement of data, and therefore the economist came into the picture, and a number of rural economic investigation or village surveys were conducted, and these were mainly by agroeconomists. Now these studies were largely statistical oriented because they were being done by economists for the purpose of collecting data. It was in terms of gathering a lot of facts and figures, and these data was kind of only in terms of statistics or number. What was lacking in this was lack of analysis or explanation of the social structure. So the embeddedness of the social and the economy was missing. Now, if we look into the development of village study in post-World War II period, we see there is a kind of a paradigm shift. And there is a shift in the way village study would be conducted, is also in terms of coming in of the method of study, where the participant observation becomes significant. Now, post-World War period, it will be also a time when there will be kind of a shift from tribal studies to rural studies. And once there is a shift for this, the interest in village study emerged from the needs of program and policy for nationwide planned economic development, and also because if we kind of look into what was happening in the discourse of sociology and anthropology, the participant observation was kind of being supported and was kind of considered as essential for studying village in India. This was also because of the whole idea of the earlier studies, where most of them were kind of based on documentations and studying of literature. So the idea was to go into the village and study it. So if we look into the post-independent period, which has been described as an era of village study, because this by post-independent India, that is 1950s, 60, village study becomes established as a field of inquiry. So there was a kind of during this phase, the focus was on revivalist, and patriotic reformist. So you already have a set of idea or this discourse which was kind of giving us a negative picturization. And then though you have this nationalist struggle, and you have your independence, and then programs and policies for the overall development of India. So there we pitch in the village study, which was kind of look into in terms of pragmatic social work, oriented studies for rural welfare programs. So the village project became a model for nation building in the post-independent era. As a result, the community became known as a laboratory for direct cultural change. So in the post-independent era, one of the earliest push toward village study was the demand for planning machinery for data on the village for the purpose of designing development programs. Srinivas argues that the focus of these studies during the post-independent period were the economic lives of the people, so as to document the imminent economic problems of the rural life. So you already had a kind of a context in which it was kind of considered as underdeveloped or barbaric, and therefore it was required that certain understanding of the economic conditions is kind of understood, because once the belief was, or the idea was, that once the economy improved, the social cultural life of the people would improve. And this kind of also looks into the kind of creating a inferior kind of, or a kind of a negative attitude towards village. So village was identified as traditional, as somewhere where in order to progress you had to migrate to urban areas, or you had to move to cities. So therefore there was this was entirely based on the materialistic economic understanding of the life of villagers. The economics and material well-being of the village became the focus of village study in the post-independent studies. So when we look into the post-independent period, we also try to understand that it is very important to understand this shift, and the shift was from what M.N. Srinivas calls from a book view to a field view, or in terms of a qualitative method. So much of the colonial administrator, or the much of the documents which were being done by the surveys and large scale surveys and village studies were in terms of numbers, in terms of quantifiable. So the argument that came in from sociologists and anthropologists was to develop a field-based study, and therefore the most important feature of field study in the post-independent period was the use of participant observation, a method of data collection that anthropologists in the West had developed while studying of tribal communities. Becoming a participant observer through intensive fieldwork was considered as the most fruitful method of gaining access to the world of village. According to Andre Bette, participant observation method was seen as a method that understood social life from within, in terms of the values and meanings attributed to the people by themselves. So field view and is actually based on your participant observation. So this is contrast to the book view, which was in terms of reading discourses, or kind of based on secondary data. So M.N. Srinivas has noted that intensive fieldwork experience was crucial for the sociology of India, and therefore 1950s and 60s we see a lot of fundamental change in the way villages were studied. So the interconnection between social structure and economy and politics started. So this is how we look into the way in which village studies in India emerged and got institutionalized. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.